It's called the land of the Golden Pagodas, considered one of the most exotic and untouched countries on the planet. After decades of dictatorship, the Southeast Asian country of Myanmar is opening up to the world. I wanted to know more about this emerging nation that's been locked away for the better part of a century. So I got a journalist visa, boarded a plane, and set off on a trip to the other side of the globe. After about 2 days of flying, traveling thousands of miles, I finally made it to the bustling streets of the largest city, Yangon, where international business is just beginning.
Okay, so we just got here in Myanmar, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, but it's also going through a major period of change. That's because the government, which used to be a military dictatorship, is now transitioning to a democracy, which is a pretty big deal. So the entire world is watching to see what happens here in Myanmar.
My journey began by paying respect to Buddha.
Got to take off our shoes and socks. Myanmar is a country that's mostly Buddhist. In fact, all over the place, like everywhere, you can see these golden shrines called pagodas, and they're to honor Buddha. All right, so this is Shell. Shell, say hi to the camera. Shell is our driver, and we're about to light candles to pay respect and honor to Buddha. It's supposed to give us good luck. So now we're gonna have really good luck throughout our time here. I think that's pretty good. Maybe it won't rain anymore.
Myanmar is a land of ancient Buddhist customs. Some of the temples here date back hundreds, even thousands of years.
Made it.
Of the 48.7 million people living in Myanmar, approximately 90% practice Buddhism. The Shwedagon Pagoda, one of the most sacred sites in the entire country, is probably the most distinct example. Measuring over 300 feet tall, this golden structure dominates Yangon's skyline and is surrounded by hundreds of Buddhist shrines. Thousands of people come here to pray every year.
It's probably one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen.
Opulence and beauty are everywhere you go, putting Myanmar at the top of the bucket list for tourists. But there's also another side to Myanmar. Tomorrow, we take a look at the history of the country and the controversy around it.
Myanmar is a beautiful country where we have a lot of diversity on culture, religion, and ethnicity.
Weiwei Nu knows two different Myanmars, a country that's moving toward democracy.
I was very ambitious when I was young. I wanted to be an educated person. I have many dreams.
And a country where freedom doesn't exist.
When I was young, Myanmar was under military dictatorship. People are very afraid of being arrested or, scared of the government.
That's what happened to her and her family when they spoke out against the government. Without a fair trial, Weiwei and her mom were sentenced to 17 years in prison. Her father, 45.
And we were so shocked, and we didn't expect that we will be arrested. In the prison, there were often verbal abuse and physical abuses. Psychological torture, yeah.
She wasted away behind bars for 7 years before one day unexpectedly being released.
After a few weeks, I went back to my university and I basically started my education again.
Weiwei's story is not uncommon. In fact, it's happened to thousands of people. That's because for nearly 5 decades, Myanmar was ruled by a military group called a junta and was known as a police state. The military government limited free speech and the press, spied on its own people, and cracked down on anyone who didn't agree with them. The US didn't consider the junta to be a legitimate government, so for years, the US officials called the country by its former name, Burma. They also imposed sanctions, restrictions on trade, that crippled the country's economy and isolated Myanmar from the rest of the world. But in the last decade, the country began opening up. In 2011, the military government held its first credible election in 50 years. The following year, President Obama became the first US president ever to visit. And recently, the US lifted the trade restrictions, and President Obama referred to the country as Myanmar. One of the faces driving change in Myanmar is activist Aung San Suu Kyi, who was elected to lead the country as state counselor. She won a Nobel Peace Prize for her effort to bring democracy to Myanmar, including spending 20 years under house arrest by the government. Now she's based in Myanmar's capital, Naypyidaw. It's an extravagant city, 40 times larger than Washington, D.C. The junta carved it out of the jungle just 10 years ago.
So most of what we've seen so far in Myanmar has been a lot of poverty, but when you get to Naypyidaw, it gives you this kind of imperial vibe. It almost kind of feels like we're in the Hunger Games or something and we're driving through the capital.
This bizarre city seems more like a compound, with giant buildings, vacant 10-lane highways, and almost no people or cars. This is the center of the government, but there's a catch. The military still holds enough seats in parliament to strike down any law it wants, and critics say that makes it really difficult for any real change to happen. For the time being, perhaps the biggest changes will be the cultural ones. In 2014, just 1% of the population had access to internet.
Basically, everyone who have access to a telephone are on Facebook.
And as the country opens up to the rest of the world, many have a new sense of hope.
I hope that for the education and the economy, everything will continue to open up.
There will be more opportunities than before the transition to democracy, and everything will be much better.
While good things are happening, the country still has a long way to go. Many believe the old military government is still in charge, and Myanmar has been accused of human rights abuses. Some people, including Weiwei, say the US should not have lifted the sanctions.
We thought this is very premature move from the United States without seeing any human rights progress, particularly to those who are the most vulnerable.
All of these graves over here and all of these ones are new. How new?
These graves are 5 or 2 days. This one is yesterday.
Josanima has seen many people in his community disappear.
Since the violence, I've buried more than 1,000 people in this year, including children. I've buried nearly 500.
Their names and identity have made them a target.
It makes me feel very sad. I feel so sad when I have to bury someone. I don't want to eat.
These are the many faces, young and old, of Myanmar's Rohingya, called the most persecuted minority in the world by the United Nations.
What makes Rohingya unique is that they're stateless. This is an ethnic minority Muslim population in the country. And statelessness is also an abuse that leads to many other human rights violations.
They're a group of about 1 million Muslims in a population that's 90% Buddhist, and have considered the westernmost part of Myanmar home for centuries. But the government believes they're illegal immigrants from neighboring Bangladesh and doesn't recognize them as rightful citizens. In the 1980s, the Rohingya were stripped of their citizenship, and years of tension boiled over in 2012 in the form of violent riots. The world was shocked to see normally peaceful Buddhist monks fighting against the Rohingya.
Muslim communities were targeted, they were burned to the ground, people were forced from their homes. We've documented killings, rape, torture, arbitrary arrest and detention. Those who stayed behind or tried to salvage their communities were attacked viciously. Essentially, the city of Sittwe has been ethnically cleansed of all Rohingya.
On the streets of Sittwe today, you won't find any Rohingya. That's because the mostly Buddhist government forced them to leave their homes temporarily to stop the violence. But now, 4 years later, this is where more than 140,000 Rohingya still live, makeshift camps that some call open-air prisons. People here live in horrible conditions with almost no freedom, and the government won't allow them to leave.
We have just been surviving. If we cannot get any food, we survive on just rice. We don't know why the government keeps us like this. They treat us like animals.
The dire conditions even led to a migrant crisis in 2015, with thousands of men, women, and children attempting to make it to neighboring Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. Trapped for days on rickety cargo boats unfit for sea, with little food or water. After international attention, some people were rescued.
The Rohingya have been discriminated against, significantly. And that's part of the reason they're fleeing.
But thousands are missing, either drowned or sold off into slavery by international criminals.
In most cases, when Rohingya board these ships, they're essentially treated as property of these human traffickers. They're stripped of all of their belongings, deprived of adequate food, deprived of water. On the ships, we've documented torture, we've documented killings.
Despite obvious suffering, the treatment of this minority is largely supported by the general public in Myanmar. Along with many countries around the world, Myanmar has seen a rise in discrimination and hate against people who are different, like the Rohingya, whose skin color and religion make them a minority. Here, that hate is strengthened by fake news stories and misinformation from the government and nationalist groups.
What they tried to do was convince the Buddhist population of Myanmar that their way of life, that their religion was under threat by a growing, and they would argue, violent Muslim population. The reality was far different.
We spoke with Wirathu. He leads an anti-Muslim movement with growing popularity and has even been called the face of Buddhist terror.
Muslim children will be a threat to the country. They will destroy our religion and snatch away our lands.
He's been accused of encouraging violence against the Rohingya.
Is that the teaching of Buddha?
I'm always watching them and giving awareness to my people not to be attacked by them. You see more and more people wearing burqas and hijabs than before. The nationalist movement is mainly about the security of the country and the security of the language we speak and our religion. If there are no Muslims, the country would be at peace. You can see Muslims commit crimes all over the world.
Many fear his influence and large following make him a threat to stability in a country that's still stumbling toward democracy. Meanwhile, the Rohingya are losing something that's vital: hope.
We have no hope, because if the international community is silent, we have no chance of being freed from this camp.
Tomorrow we head inside the camps, a place where journalists are almost never allowed. In order to get into the camps where the Rohingya now live, we had to travel to a remote part of Myanmar called the Rakhine State, where journalists are almost never allowed. And within hours of being there, we heard the Tamada, the local military, was searching for us, so we had to sneak our way into the camps.
Duck, okay. We're ducking through the police checkpoint.
That's where we met Jack.
So this market is still like this now.
He used to be a student at the local university. When the violence broke out in 2012, he was forced to drop out.
For us, we have no freedom movement. We have no options inside of the camp.
He showed us around.
This is a room for five?
For 5 family members. So we have to stay here inside of the room, all together, male and female.
We quickly learned life here is pretty bleak. Children are born without birth certificates, meaning they have no national identity. Food is hard to come by. There's virtually no economy or job opportunities. Only one small school. But probably the most crippling thing, no medical access.
Many healthcare issues that could easily be solved can in some cases be life-threatening. For a woman that's pregnant or has gone into labor, that can be the difference between life and death.
The government has kicked out the vast majority of aid groups, including large international nonprofits like Doctors Without Borders. People can't get the healthcare they need.
My sickness keeps getting worse and worse.
Are you able to care for your family?
It's impossible to take care of my family. I'm so sick, and all I want is treatment.
I keep getting these painful welts. It's nearly impossible for me to walk. The pain is unbearable.
Oh my gosh.
I've had this for 4 years.
So they're suffering, even dying, adding to an ever-growing number of graves along the remote waterfronts of the camps. It's been called ethnic cleansing. Some have even called it genocide. The government, led by Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi, has been criticized by the international community for not helping the Rohingya or even recognizing them as part of Myanmar, leaving them with no rights and no one to advocate on their behalf. We tried to get an interview with Suu Kyi, but she did not get back to us by the time of this report. In a statement released in 2016, a government spokesperson said, We won't use the term Rohingya because Rohingya are not recognized as among the 135 official ethnic groups. Our position is that using the controversial term does not support the national reconciliation process and solving problems. Jack says the Rohingya feel abandoned.
We have no options here. No one can rescue us. No one can give a voice for our community.
But he hopes as more people learn about the Rohingya, more people will want to help. As we left the camps, I couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. The people there were stuck in a perpetual and vicious cycle of suffering. But I could leave. Tom Hansen, Channel 1 News.